streets of movement, such as Plainfield Avenue, Springfield Avenue, Mountain Avenue, Valley Road, and Diamond Hill Road. Commissioners did not apparently think that was that important, but by continually coaxing and having pressure put on them by others, they finally widened all of them except Mountain Avenue, and the town didn't want that to be widened anyhow because they would have taken so many trees down, and others felt to only make this a speed track for people coming into town and going to Bell Laboratories and other businesses in New Providence that existed. So that was repaved and widened just a little bit, and everybody seemed to be happy about the way that ended up. The paving of Park Avenue was a great thing. We were able to borrow money for that tract from the local bank at 1% interest, and we kept paying them back as we progressed, and so we did. And it was a narrow road with deep ditches in part and some hilly sections, and so this ran from Plainfield Avenue by the town hall all the way over to Mountain Avenue at the westerly end. My gracious, when it finished, it was such an improvement that it was hard to believe that it could be as nice as it was. And then there was a lot of development in this area, and it certainly was a timely thing to do, because it all of a sudden it got more use than it ever did. And another thing that I wanted to say with the sewer contracts, the town itself had a lot of roads that were so-so. And so when we put in the sewers, which was always down the center of the road, and then we would cut across and the road, and between the curb and the sidewalk area, we would put a hook in, so that if anybody was pumping too much water, surface water or whatever, this could be detected from the road without going on private property. But when these roads were backfilled after the pipes had been put in, we let it stand for about 3 months, and then contracted out to have the road tarred and stones put on the way it should be. And in some cases, the roads were not even macadam. They were just sort of dirt tracks. But when we got through, wherever we worked, we restored the road or rebuilt it so that it was in good shape. And this was all part of the contract. So, the people were a lot better served than they ever had been before, because they didn't have to worry about septic tanks. They had a decent road, and their sewage was all carried away, so they had no worries of failure of their septic system. The area between Mountain Avenue and Valley Road was pretty much owned by a Mr. Grassman, who was, as you may imagine, quite wealthy. He was an engineering company in Elizabeth, and he was a good friend of the folks in politics in Berkeley Heights. He, I understand, had gotten Bell Laboratories to come into Berkeley Heights, and New Providence didn't want. They had a chance to have Bell Laboratories, but they didn't want it, according to what the story goes. And so the folks in Berkeley Heights said, yeah, we'll take it. So all the buildings that are in the Bell Laboratories, so-called Murray Hill, are all in Berkeley Heights, and therefore they pay their taxes for these buildings and any land in that area to Berkeley Heights. The front 500 feet where the grass is in New Providence. So New Providence can tax it for the 500 feet of grass, but not the buildings. New Providence also has Mountain Avenue in this area. So they also get all the traffic on Mountain Avenue coming and going, of these folks coming and going to work. During my time there, I noticed that Bell Laboratories had big buildings, and I think at least 4 of them, and between them they had like a mall. And the next thing you know, why the Bell people were in to see us, they wanted to put a new building up between these 4 that were there, 3 stories high, and tying the whole unit together as one. And we thought that was a pretty nice thing, and we insisted also that in addition to the trees in their parking area and all macadam, that directly in front of the building, they could park about a dozen cars, but they had to mound the earth and then shrub it so that cars could not be seen from the road. And while this seemed like a little much of a stipulation, they were glad to do it, and they did it, and they were happy with it because it led a sort of a stationary piece of property, and not one of these with buildings where buildings were, and a lot of macadam, and was also present with cars. Cars were all parked in a nice parking area to the north of these buildings. The time that Luther Smythe and George Lohman ran for the Township Committee and won, giving the so-called minority of the pass a majority, which went on for many years. I also, at that time, was asked to be the superintendent of the Sunday school, which I accepted and carried out for, I guess, about 7 years, somewhere around there. And we attended the Diamond Hill Community Church, which was sponsored by the Methodist Church, and I found all Presbyterian Sunday school booklets, materials there, which were used for the Christian education of the kids. And it was a great place to be. We enjoyed being there on Sunday for services, me earlier for Sunday school. And we saw to it that the kids all went to their Sunday school and got home. Our friends the Westerbergs used to have some delicious beefsteak, loin of beef, and they had 2 settings, and boy, we used to enjoy all the good food and sociability, and the members of the church were backing me in politics, even after I got office, where we would have some serious differences of opinion down on the township committee. I got the backing of most of the time from the church. So then they said it was said around town that was the political hotbed of Berkeley Heights, and that got around. Not true though, but I did have a lot of support. Several years later, the Presbyterians established a beginning of settling in Berkeley Heights, and they started meeting in a home on Plainfield Avenue, just to the west of Mountain Avenue. And one of the members, I can't remember their name, but anyhow, they owned the property on the corner there, running back to the Hamilton school. And so this was turned over to the Presbyterians as a gift. And then with time, why, they started a building program, and so I believe the church is now just the way it was then, and a lovely building, and the minister was the Reverend Sheldon, and he retired about the time that we were up in Vermont. I'd say also with regard to the sewer plant, as time went by, state regulations increased, and the volume of sewage with a population of 14,000 and the businesses just could not handle the capacities that I had been involved with. So new approaches were made. More metals had to be taken out before they could go into the Passaic River, which, as you might know, was a potable water system. In other words, the water could be taken out for drinking, and there were a number of sewage plants beyond Berkeley Heights to the south, to the northeast. Eventually the Passaic River comes out in Newark after it wanders through Patterson and that general area. So they were required to build a new treatment plant. I think it ran around $13 million. We had spent roughly about $300,000 with the earlier two plants, and then there were new processes. We had used sand beds to float out the solids and let them dry on the sand, and then this was raked off and taken off by trucks, the solids dry. This was not a good system for the winter months because you could only flood them. You didn't get any drying, lack of heat from the sun. And so they put in some machines that squeeze the solids of water, and then the water was taken back and retreated, and the solids were disposed of. I don't know where it went to, but I think it went down to around New Brunswick and was burnt up. Now, when I checked 2 years ago, there's a company that's been hired to operate the sewer plant, and I believe the liquid solids are taken away by truck. Where they are disposed of, I do not know. That just is not available. I might also mention that when we started the project of sewers and so on, there is a plaque now in the new building which has the names of all those that participated, the township committee, first and second time, and the third time, and in those early plaques, my name is mentioned, so that if you all ever go down to the sewer plant and go into that building, as you go in the entry hallway, you will see at one end these plaques. And I'm rather proud of that because I spent 10 years handling as for the town, all the problems that we ran into, and also the good points, and also saying that all the other members there were as helpful as I tried to be to make that whole investment worthwhile and efficient. We had nowhere to go with our sewage. The joint meeting, which included Maplewood, South Orange, Summit, New Providence. I can't think of any other. They used to call it the joint meeting, and their sewage plant was down in the Kill there in Elizabeth. During those years that I was a member of the Township Committee, I served in 1964, 1966, and 1967 as mayor, and that was a nice honor, and I enjoyed being in that position, and also enjoyed being able to help fashion the way the town was to be operated, and our office was in the new town hall, and it was a lovely room. I always was very proud of it, and of course the court is in there now as well, having their hearings in the earlier part of the week. Other improvements have been made at the town hall since I was there, and it looks as though it's being run very nicely. And of course, all the people that I knew are no longer there. They've either deceased or are retired, enjoying their work efforts, and so that's the way things go. Also, might mention that on up by the Catholic Church, the new one, not the one on Plainfield Avenue. I can't think of the name of that road. I used to know it well, but it's Hamilton Avenue there. And look, and I've never been in it, and I think it has 6 bays, and the local fire department fellows, are all volunteer, certainly enjoy it and having that, and the town went to for great expense to put up such a elaborate building, and the fellows have excellent fire equipment. About once every 2 or 3 years, we get down to Berkeley Heights when we're visiting Morna and Mendham, and Jim, and we come down to see what's going on in Berkeley Heights, and I'm very impressed with the business area as it has developed. It still has some things to do to improve it, but it's not a big shopping center, a mall. There's no such thing. It's mostly individual business people that have put in money and carrying on their business. And it looks prosperous. It looks neat. The stores in the majority do not look too bad. The bank building looks good, and other general development. But in the most westerly part of the town, that is, as you're going west to the right, beyond the business section and back there are lovely homes, and I never thought that this area would develop the way it has, and those that have done this are to be complimented for the beauty of the area. Very nice. The new construction of the office building, and I don't know how many there will be, but one is going up now, and that's down where the Runnels Hospital used to be. This has been at a standstill down there for some time, but now it's going forward, and this is what was behind our minds many years ago, that that area would be a good rateable, and also eliminate a lot more housing in those areas rather than what's going in. I understand that Plainfield Avenue has been widened, so it's almost a 4-lane road, and it goes up to the top of the hill and connects with Route 78. In connection with this, it took 30 years from the time that we approved with the state of New Jersey the route that 78 was going to take through the town. We got them to move 3 times, and because they were going to cut, in the first case, right across the town sideways, so that it just would have destroyed the town and put a Chinese wall through it. And then the other was to go through 3 acres, and that would have destroyed that. And then the third is down where it's where it is. And they've done a lot of things to curb noise to the residents where it comes close to them. And they have these walls, buffers of sound, and then over by the Watchung Park, they had a bridge built so that deer and other animals could go over the bridge from one side of the park to the other without meeting and being killed by the traffic on 78. So this was all things that various individuals put up as requirements if they were going to accept the state's plan of 78. But we got the final location in 1956, and in 1986 the road was opened, finally. Very interesting how things can get dragged out over not too important things, in my opinion. With Route 78 and Route 20 connecting into Route 24, you can get from Berkeley Heights down to Newark Airport in about 20 minutes. And this is amazing compared with what I used to have to put up to going up and down 22 to get into New York. But it's absolutely amazing, and it's hard to believe that you could pass from one community to the next in going 60 miles an hour, and this was, this is completely different, but a good move. And I think that Berkeley Heights will have more ratables in the office building and lab moving into town because of the nearness to the airport. And we know that people fly a great deal on business trips. And it's handy for anybody that wants to fly. So what we did, I think, will still earn new ratables for Berkeley Heights as time passes. And that's a good thing. And it's an excellent residential area, and all the properties have been turned into building sites, and so the town is full, and the population should remain somewhere right around 14,000. I don't know exactly what it is, but we have a census coming up in another year. We'll know then. Another thing comes to mind, and that is what used to be called the Lackawanna Railroad, which comes from Peapack goes into Summit and then joins the main line. And this service will take you either to Hoboken, or at some point you can get a train that will take you up to the Penn Station in New York City. And this is a service that has been wanting for a long time, and I think it's great that you can either go into Hoboken and get on a tube and go downtown, or you can go transfer at some point. I don't know just how it works, but get on a train that will take you up to 33rd Street, and that's great service. Just wanted to update also, it's my understanding that that regional system of schools, there were 6 communities that were tied in, and Berkeley Heights was one of them for high schools, and that has broken up, and it's my understanding that Berkeley Heights now has not only grade schools but also high school, and the high school belongs to they bought it, the town. So it's it's got the grade schools all scattered around. Kids can walk to and from school, with minor exceptions, of course. Going to Governor Livingston, you have to have some people have to go by bus, but a lot of people drive to work and thriving, not work, but can drive to the high school in a thriving community. I will just touch on David Corder Dowley, briefly. When I finished high school, I took a postgraduate course because there was no money around for going to college in our family, and things were real bad when I graduated in 1933, and so we had a postgraduate class of 81, and that was because we just couldn't go on. So rather than be floating around, we went back to school and took some subjects that either we felt we needed to be sharpened up on, or ones that we hadn't taken. And we were all good friends, so it was nice, and we didn't interfere with the ones that were supposed to be. We just integrated ourselves and managed well. After that, I was able to go to New York University, and by doing that, I could live at home. I could take the train into New York, and the Christopher Street boat took me across to New York, and then I walked from there over to Washington Square. And I learned to meet a fellow by the name of Jones, who lived in South Orange, was in high school, and he was going over there to take up a law course. And so at least I had somebody to chat with in walking, because it was a good 15-minute walk from the ferry boat to Washington Square. The course was in business management, and I had marketing courses, and I specialized in foreign marketing, and so I went to school there, and until I was able to get a job with Dietz and Company, and they were located on the 42nd floor of 39 Rockefeller Center, and it was quite something to drive into work. And then the elevated train, 6th Avenue elevated, went right up to the building, and then with time, a couple of years, why they were down below digging out the ground for a subway. But they had to maintain traffic, and truck traffic, car traffic. They also had to maintain the elevated and still do the digging and get the subway, and quite a remarkable thing. But eventually, one of the stations was right at 39 Rockefeller Plaza, and of course this was great because of the music hall there, and all the other office buildings, and it was a great atmosphere. And saw the Queen Mary coming in on her maiden voyage, and that was in 1936. It was a lot of fun going to work and going to school and going across on the ferry boat. There were all windows up on the second floor, or second deck, you might say, and they had chairs there, like park chairs, and you could sit and watch. But going at the time that I did, there were a lot of ships, passenger ships, coming into New York, and going back and forth. While you get pretty close to them, and on the boat, and you could see their names, and most of them were docking up around, I'd say 23rd Street. They called them the Chelsea Piers. U.S. Lines was there, and others. And a little further up, that's where the Queen Mary docked, up in around, I guess, 90 in those terminals up there. They were built for passengers, more or less, just for that. Right next to the Lackawanna terminal there in Hoboken, the Leviathan was tied up there for a number of years for lack of use and lack of passengers, and not only that, but they just didn't generate enough money to operate it. And of course, it was built before World War I and had been updated. But anyhow, after a while, I remember, and I have some pictures of her backing out. They had cut some of the funnels off so that when they got to Scotland, where it was going to be broken up for scrap and done away with. And there were other ships about the same size as that, the Cunard Line, and also the Cunard White Star Line. I guess they were separate at that time, but they did get together. And then there were then I remember it sailing, and boy, all the black smoke that came out of the funnels while she was getting started. Takes a little bit of a trick to get those nozzles in the bunkers fine-tuned so that you get the right combination of air and fuel. Well, after a while I left Dietz, and they said they didn't need me anymore. I was only making $20 a week, so it was no great loss. And then I went to work for American Airlines as an agent at Fort Newark, and this was after Mom and I were married, and I was making a lot of money for that, and I just didn't fit into it. I didn't like it, and so I left after a year, and I was unemployed for about 3 months until I got a job as a clerk in the inventory department of Moore McCormick, which was at Exchange Place in Jersey City. That's where they had been. The reason I got the job was that they had the old service was American Scanty Line, and they had 4 Hog Island ships that were converted to carry about 50 passengers, and they went all up through Scandinavia all the way to Russia, stopping at ports in each country. And so they would dock. It was called Pier D, Jersey City. And then there was the Bormac Gulf Line, which went down to Texas and in that area. And they, amongst other things, the big thing was they carried around 30,000 barrels of fuel oil. And when they were in, when the American Scanty Line ships were in, they had pipeline up across the rafters and down from one pier side to the other pier side, and they could refuel those American Scanty Line ships from the Bormac Gulf Line, and they could get cheaper rates that way for their oil than any other way. And so this was rather interesting, and I used to get down in the morning and watch the longshoremen loading freight, and they were just introducing forklift trucks at that time, and so they were using pallets to put freight on and so on. So it was a whole new concept, and one of the big freights coming in from the American Scanty Line was paper pulp and fish oil, and then also hams from Poland. So it was a rather interesting thing going on at that location, and then but I worked in the inventory there, and we were pricing all kinds of equipment and dishes and, well, all kinds of things to get the value of what was on the ship. They needed those for establishing prices for the purchase of the ship. And then they came and bid in and received what they call the American Republic's line, and that was 3 passenger ships, the Argentina, the Brazil, and the Uruguay, and they were kept docked up at Pier 60 North River, which is around 23rd Street, and called the Chelsea section of New York, even today, and the Chelsea piers, and I understand a couple of those piers are been converted to sports centers for people who care to go there. It's rather a novel idea. And then, along with that, they got what they call 6 cargo vessels of the West Coast type. Apparently during World War I, some of these ships were built out on the West Coast, which were basically the same as far as tonnage, but as appearance and design, they were different than the Hog Island ships, which were built on the East Coast. Anyhow, that's what they got, the 3 big ships and the other 6. And as a result of that, why my job firmed up. And I also used to have to go down and where the big ships were, all the foodstuffs they received had to be inspected by the Department of Agriculture, and also the steamship company representative who was responsible, Mr. Hunsinger, and that was he was a representative. He had been the chef on the Leviathan at one time, I understand, and then there was another gentleman from that department called the Steward Department, Mr. Carey, Arthur Carey, and he was English, a very nice man. And then the one who headed it up was Mr. Richardson, and he was the chief steward on the Leviathan. And so we had some rather famous people in what they were doing during their life. Anyhow, that was the job. And then we had the bombing of Pearl Harbor, and it wasn't long after that all these ships the 3 big ships were converted for troop ships, painted gray, and I understand that each one of those could handle about 5,000 troops. It's amazing because they got kind of crowded when you had 400 passengers on there during times of no war. So, but those ships, 3 ships, they were the Good Neighbor fleet to South America, going to Brazil, Uruguay, and Argentina, and that's why they got their names. The next thing was that when the ships were all painted gray and no more passengers, only troops and so on, and then one day, it was a foggy, rainy day, and I was down on the pier, at the end of the pier, and all of a sudden this big ship goes by real close to the pier. And I later found out that was the Queen Elizabeth. And so she was going uptown to be finished off to carry troops. They had just gotten it all together and fueled up and so on, and the idea was to get it over here where more materials were available, and she could be set up to start carrying troops like the Queen Mary. Now that was quite an experience. She differed in appearance, a little more streamlined than the Queen Mary, and she only had 2 stacks where the Mary had 3. So it was easy as time went by to identify one or the other, but they were both big, a little over 1,000 feet and somewhere around 83,000 tons each. Of course, we know where the Queen Mary is today, entertaining the public who are curious about her. So I was not subject to the draft because we had our little daughter there at Mortem. She was around 2.5 at the time. And so I got information that I could go to Charleston and join a cadre, but I wasn't to be drafted. So I went down there, and job turned into one of really learning how to load a ship, and it was a new base, and the fellow in charge was Colonel Bartoloni, a very nice man, And the only time you had to watch out for him was he always had a cigar when he arrived, and he walked down the dock. And if the cigar was rolling in his mouth, well, watch out. But if it was straight out, and he seemed relaxed, boy, it was a good day. So, but anyhow, down there the Army, it was called the Charleston Port of Embarkation, and it was in North Charleston, just north of Charleston. And so we would load ships there. There was another area it was on the Cooper River, and north of that there was the ammunition dock, and quite often we loaded 3,000 tons of bombs into these Liberties, 250, 500, and 1,000-pound bombs for the Air Force. And then they would come back down to the regular terminal where we were at, and we would load all trucks and vans and foods. Ships from those that I was working with, in supervisory positions. And I got training for 12 hours every day, and we had night shifts, so 1 week you'd work days, the next week you'd work nights. The weather was in the 90s all the time, and I think it was over 100 sometimes on those ships, just absorbing the heat from the sun over there. And there was a paper pump plant next door, and the odors from that were terrible. And we got a great deal of that because the winds were southwest and came right our way, but nobody could do anything about that. While I was working there, we used to have to travel 20 miles to a town called Somerville, and at that time it had a population of about 1,500. It was, the sea level at that point was 75 feet. There were tremendous trees in town which did help to cool things down at night so you could get a good sleep, plus the fact that you were very tired. And you drive down in a car in the morning, and when you arrived at the port there, your shirt back would be soaked, just from sitting in the car. But we all got together, and there'd be 4 or 5 of us riding in the car because gas tickets were hard to get. We could get them, but you couldn't over-ask either. So we always did a lot of little, covering up for each other. And I met some people there that I liked very much. One was Bob Hemphill, and he since, I think, has had a successful business. I saw his name on a hardware store there, I think it was. Could be that Bob's son was taken over, but we socialized with them to some extent, but not overly so. You never do in those situations. And we stayed to begin with, at the Pine Tree Inn, and that was a great spot, old hotel, and it was where there were a lot of officers stayed there, and they were Air Force officers mainly. We didn't get a chance to socialize with them too much because they had their own thing going, and of course I was in another category and putting in a lot of hours, so it didn't make. But we could eat our dinner there, And then Mom could, we had an electric stove, two-burner stove, and that was plugged in, and so we could heat up cereals or whatever things for Mom during the day, and also some water. There was a big bed in the room. You had to get on a stool to get in this thing, and had the posters, and there was rather unique furniture in it, and there's one that I always wished I had picked up, bought. It was two chairs tied together, but they one faced the other. They were a side of each other to a certain extent. It's hard to explain, but then two people could sit down and face each other, and I think that's a rather unique thing. I've never seen any since. After we had been there for a while, Mom came down, and then she'd go back, come down, then go back, depending on, she wasn't like every week. This was like maybe 3 or 4 months, and she'd come down with Lorna. And we stayed, I made out to stay with people by the name of Kamensky. They were Polish people, and he worked for Stephen Oren Company up in Baltimore. And he was a Marine superintendent. Well, we got along fine, and we shared expenses and efforts and so on. His wife was Kitty, and she was a good Polish cook. And he was quite a character, kind of rough, but in his speech, but not otherwise. And well, we had to chop wood to get fuel for the fireplace, and we had oil, and it had it in a compartment and that was built for it, and then there was a fan up above, and that blew the heat out into the living room. But it was a nice little house, brick, and in a nice location. Had a porte-cochere so you could park your car under there at night. And then later on we found another home. It was an old southern home, and a elderly lady owned it, and she leased it out, and so we got one section of it. There were a couple other sections to it, and so we stayed there for, I can't recall, another month. We had people by the name of Harvey Parks and Myra, his wife, and he was assistant Marine superintendent, so was I, but he would go up to New York and pick up these Air Force crash boats. They were used down off Cuba, in that area, for picking up anybody that went into the sea. And so they had 3 Packard engines, and they had big tanks for gas. I guess you need it with 3 engines that size. But they moved along, and he'd bring those down from New York, mostly on the inland waterway, so that he wasn't subject to being hit by torpedoes from a submarine. Harvey was good, and he was a seaman, and he had been working in Miami and working for some wealthy people from Chicago, and he maintained their yacht, and he was very fussy, so everything, according to the way he talked, was just so, and had to be, and available, because these people come down out of the clouds, so to speak, to go out in their boat. Well, in October of 1943, Mom Norm and I and Lorna and David, soon to be, all got in the car and headed north for 57 Tuscan Street in Grammy. After we got happily home, why, I headed into New York and got a job with Nasarima, $65 a week, and I'd get paid overtime. And, well, some weeks for the overtime I was putting in, I'd get close to $300. Well, this never happened in the world, but to me. And I was very happy about it, and it helped get me back on my feet. And but they were like 12-hour shifts. You had to be there by 6, and you didn't leave until 6. And if there were a few odds and ends to do for setting up for the crew for the day, why, that's what I did. And I wouldn't get out of there at 7. They had a habit, though, of telling me around 10:30, Dave, go home. We need you tonight. And, then I'd have to get in the car after getting there around 7 in the morning, turn around, head for home, grab a few hours sleep, get some supper, and back again. And then at midnight, we'd take off for an hour and then start our operations at 1 and go through till 6 or 7 in the morning, mostly 6. That was enough. And I had the old 39 Hudson still, but the fenders were getting flappy, and I used some of that Air Force Stickum fabric sticker that they use for sealing up plastic around the plane. And I lost both the headlights, had to get 2 new ones put in. They didn't fit very well, but they gave me light, made me legal. Of course, there were no inspections at that time. And I used to trail out on the Pulaski Skyway, and then along 1 and 9, and then pick up 22, and go as far as Union, get off at Vauxhall Road, and then make a right on Burnett Avenue, and then take me right to 57. Well, and I stayed on with Nasarima for probably, till, I guess it was around 1950, and then my father convinced me to come to work with him. He didn't like me ever to be working on the waterfront, and yet I never felt in any way in jeopardy. And that was the one big mistake in my life. I went on, stayed there for a while, and then the Korean War came, and I was hired back by Nasarima, and I went down to Cave and Point, and it's all we did was, almost exclusively, was loading various vehicles, mostly what we call 6x6, or the regular Army trucks that you most often see. And, that was a constant job. While I was there, I think I loaded 600 ships. It was right in that category. And Cave Point is down there in Bayonne. And then there was another area in Bayonne, I think it was called Paramount Terminal. But anyhow, it was something like that. Well, that was another. And I remember I worked for about a week on a ship at night, and it was setting up on a ship like a storage area like you'd see in a store for a drugstore here now and a mall, and all kinds of foodstuffs on little shelves and throughout the ship. Well, this ship was supposed to be used as a supply ship when they landed in Normandy. It was a real old ship, nothing new about it, but it was perfect for storage of foodstuffs so long as it didn't get hit. Another terminal unloading copra at El Dorado Corporation in Bayonne, New Jersey. They called it copra. That's without the shell. And it would be loaded into ships. Several holds in the ship were just filled with this copra. And they brought that down to dock the ships in Bayonne that appear there. And they had a Rube Goldberg operation. They had these big fans that sucked the copra up into pipes, two pipes that you would stick down into the ship's hold where the copra was, and you'd try to get down to the floor so that once you got to the floor, well, then the copra would of its own weight slide down, and then the pipes with the suction would pull it out, and it would go onto a conveyor, and at the end it would be weighed, so they knew how much weight they were getting, and then it would drop into another conveyor which would carry it over to a storage building, and the storage building had worm gears in various parts of the floor, and they would turn this on, and when they had the copra all in, and that would worm the copra out with these gears, and it would be put into presses, and the oil would be pressed out of would be chopped up and then pressed, as I remember it, and the oil would flow out and go into big vats, and then it was treated by an acid to get the very last of the oil out of the copra, and the copra was chopped up then by like wood dust, and then when that product was all taken out, all the oil was taken out by acid, then this would go over into freight cars and be loaded, and then it was sent south to where they raised cattle, and then what they call black strap. That's a black syrupy fluid coming from sugar, and so like sawdust from the copra and the black strap were mixed and fed to cattle, and this went on, and the oil would be put in barges, small barges, and taken up to the companies that made soaps, and so that was called the El Dorado Oil Company. Didn't last too many years. It was quite an investment, but it never seemed to be quite successful, and I would only occasionally go over there to work, because because there were others that could go too from the companies, our company. So but anyhow, they kept me busy. It wasn't in one place, it did in another. So when that was all over, the Korean War, I guess I went back and worked for my father again, which was another big mistake. And because I was never happy. I wasn't trained to be an electrical engineer, and I was not an electrical engineer, and not a mechanical person, and nobody took a lot of effort to train me, just turn me out. So that, and I lost a lot of money because he wasn't paying me enough to really support the family. I got a job with Universal, and I started out on the East River loading ships for a small line that ran down to South America. We loaded a lot of trucks and food stuff, general cargo. They would sail every Friday night, and sometimes it was easy and sometimes it was a struggle. And the ships were not too well. They were smaller, so you really didn't have the equipment to load some of the cargo that they wanted loaded. You did it, but it was scary. And so I was there, and then all of a sudden a friend of mine, Charlie Simus, he was over in Brooklyn handling the Meyer line contract. So he asked for me to come over there because Charlie and I had worked together with Nasarima in Jersey City. Charlie was quite a guy, and they called him Jimmy Walker because he was well-dressed and quite an Irishman, smiley. And so he got me started with the Meyer Line. And Meyer Line at that time was the largest general cargo carrier in the port of New York to Europe. And so they had two piers, one for inward cargo and one for outbound cargo. And they were older piers, but, they had wooden floors. And, well, anyhow, it was a good operation, and it worked out very well. And their ship sailed on Friday night also, when you finished. And we usually finished by 9, 10 o'clock. Had good workers there. And it was a busy place. They had 8 ships. And it's a Norwegian company, but they never went to Norway. They went to Europe, to Belgium, Holland, and Germany. And so then they called them have Joe, have this or have that, and have Gerald. I can't think of the names anymore. And then have Troll. Plane that Mom and I went to Europe on, for our 25th wedding anniversary. So what does that add up to? 37 plus 25. That would be 1952. And we were going for 6 weeks. And I was on the payroll for that particular time, so the trip didn't cost me anything. I got good rates on the ship. There were only 6 passengers. And when we came back on the maiden voyage, the Havgels, and that's where we met the Fugelsangs. They were coming over for a trip through the States, and they were going up to Dartmouth to pick up their son Richard. And So we had a delightful trip. They were good company. There were 10 passengers coming back. Capacity is 12. And that was a maiden voyage for that ship. And when we got into New York Harbor, the fireboats were out there spewing water up in the air, and there were helicopters, and there were tugboats and pleasure boats, no ferry boats. And so we went up the Hudson River to just south of the George Washington Bridge, turned around, came back down, went over into Brooklyn, where the ship was to be discharged. So that was another interesting thing, and I worked with them and we also had the Prudential line there at another pier, and well, that was over in New York. I also handled their ships, and that was a good contract. And then from the Meyer line, I was transferred up to the Maersk line. It was a new operation at that Pier 11 in Brooklyn, and it was not the typical one that goes out into the water. It went along the embankment, and it had been built by the Port Authority. And it was, as I recall, I think it was 1,800 feet. You could get 2 regular freighters and 1 small one in at one time, and that happened more than once. And then on the land side of the pier, had all these doors, and you could back a truck in anywhere to the platform that was in front of the doors. So it was a great pier for moving freight. And they brought in big loads of freight from, you guessed it, Japan. After a couple of years there and things going along okay, you had to be a conscientious person this was a Danish line, and you had to be a conscientious person to get along with them. And but I truly may say that I didn't have any trouble with them. The 2 port captains were Captain Kissling and Captain Larson. Captain Larson, he was a big guy, and he had big feet, so we called him Bigfoot, not to his face, but amongst ourselves. Then there was the labor union fellow representing them, and that was Toto Mack. And he had quite a background in racketeering and so forth in Brooklyn. And after a couple of years, I was sent down to the Faro line, and there was a lot of funny politics there. And I don't know, you every Friday night you could figure you're going to be there till 12 to 2 o'clock in the morning finishing up their ships, because they received about 1,200 tons of cargo on the last day. And they carried a lot of equipment, and they went down to South Africa. And, well, I wasn't happy there, and they weren't happy with me. So then I left, and then I went up to this is all still with Universal, and then I went back up to another pier and handled the Prudential line for a while. And I got disgusted and quit. And then I went back to Pier 11 with the Maersk line, and they had 2 ways of operating there. There was the stevedoring, which just handled the ships, and then there was the other company that just delivered the cargo. And the fellow, my boss, was George Lee's gang, and his company also handled the bull line, loading their ships and so forth. So they Well, George went out of business, and then Bob Steele came in and asked me to run the operation, and so I worked with him, and then that contract was finally given up, and so then I went to work for Berkeley Heights as administrator for a couple of years, and it was that time that we started to look into a second house up in Vermont. We spent 3 years looking around, and in the meantime, called me up one day when I was working for the town and offered me a good price and asked me to come in. It would be down at Portland work and to run a warehouse. Well, most of it was paper for the press, and so I got onto that, and then there was going to be a strike, and I worked till 9 o'clock every night for weeks, and we finally had 10,000 tons of paper, raw paper, for the newsprint, Daily News, I believe it was a company, and they would send trucks over to be loaded, and we would do that at bad time when the weather got wet. And of course the paper would come in ships, so that as it was unloaded it would be put on trucks and carted over to the warehouse. Well, then they started getting shoes in from a shoe company out in Cleveland, Ohio. And then they were doing business over in Brooklyn somewhere. And they decided to close it up, and then they brought all kinds of stuff in. And boy, I'll tell you, I was going through, you never would know how many sizes, types of shoes, and how you have to store them in racks and so on, so that if somebody wants 100 of this or 200 of that, why, you have to be able to go down and get them right away, and they go on the truck, and if you don't do it, why, there's all kinds of hell because you didn't do it. And guy sent a truck down, he wants you to pay for it. Of course, we didn't. And then you have to keep a running inventory. You know, you might start out with 1,000 items. You got to segregate them, but say one is 100, well, maybe 50 will go one place, so then that means you got not 100, but 50. And so you have to keep it constant. Well, I did that, and then the company was Pittston Stevedoring, and all of a sudden, why, Bob says to me, well, we've got the contract over there, and you're the only one that we have to do it. So I went over there. Well, Moore McCormick was just getting over. It was Moore McCormick of 23rd Street and 2nd Avenue in Brooklyn, and big pier, 1,400 feet long and 300 feet wide. I put as many as 6 ships there. Of course, 2 of them were smaller, but the others were regular freighters. But I got 6 ships in there, and was working them all the time. Had about 700 people working there, and a lot of lousy equipment, high-lows. They were old and made of iron and steered like they'd never been steered. We started out with 8 ships. They had cargo in them when the strike started, so we gradually, one by one, got them unloaded, and then they headed to out ports to start loading cargo again, getting over the strike. And so that was one company, and then the next thing you know, there was the Torm line coming in there that was another Danish company. And so that made 2 lines, and then the Atlantic line came in. They had small ships going down to the West Indies, so that was 3. And then there was another single ship line, Bangladesh. And boy, that was something. They eat onions like we would put sugar in coffee. They eat them raw. And everything, the whole air on the ship is onions. Well, anyhow, so that made 4 lines, and that pier got so busy. We were going all the time, and then McCormick started to pick up their business, and we put containers and heavy lifts on another pier next to ours. Well, they were both more McCormick, but one was without a shed, just plain. But we'd load containers there and for the ships, and then they'd bring in a derrick, and they would put a barge alongside of the ship, and then this derrick, floating derrick, would be outside of that. But that way he could reach over to the pier without a shed and pick up heavy lifts and containers and bring them over, swing around, and then bring them down and land in the hold of the ship or on deck, wherever it was designated to go. Well, that was quite an operation, but there were an awful lot of 9 o'clock nights, and I would get in. I would have to leave home at 6 o'clock in the morning to get through the Holland Tunnel and over the Brooklyn Bridge to the pier. I get there about 7:15, but that, in a lot of ways, that was good because I knew what was going on before things started. Whether barges were coming in with certain freight, or I got a good view of where things were, and to see that the labor came in and got to where they're supposed to go to work and so forth. And you'd be working maybe 3 ships at one time, and it was tough, and it could include Saturdays, once in a while a Sunday when you had to work, but mainly Saturday. If you had a lot of wet weather, it couldn't work, and had to send the gangs home. Well, you had to make up the time to put the cargo on, so you would start on, you'd work on Saturday. But sometimes that was good because I had a fellow that was like a secretary, and we'd go through reports, and I'd get caught up with my paperwork, so that it would go into New York office. But it was an interesting and perhaps the biggest job I ever had on the waterfront. And not many people get a job that big on the waterfront. But that was a busy place, and designed though for activity, and I had a lot of good equipment. So then finally after 3 years, I went up to the front office and told Bob Sorello, he was the president, told him that I wanted to get over to New Jersey, and they had a job going with the American Present lines over there, the contract, and so it was figured out that somebody else would take my place. They brought a couple of people in to take my place over in Brooklyn, and I came over to Newark, and that was a container operation. You were inbound containers had everything from furniture to personal effects to typewriters, you name it, different types of good cargo. And then there was another building where we received freight for outbound, going out to Japan or Port Swettenham or where. And so we had the unloading and delivery of cargo there and going out, but it was all in containers. And then when the ship would come in, why, we had 2 cranes that would work on the ship, taking containers out, loading them, and so on. And then we always seemed to have extra containers. There were more containers coming in than going out. So we had to load the empty containers. And so this was a much smaller operation, but I had a lot of thievery going on, and finally got measures through and working with customs and custom agents why we stopped it. And so that was good. And so that was about it. And I forgot one company that I worked for, but it's not worth talking about, so I'm not going to. So I think I pretty well told, well, what made me finish with Shirello was my heart attack on Christmas Eve in 1974. And I was in the hospital for several weeks, and then I was home for another month, and then I went to St. Luke's in New York and had the operation, survived, and never went back to work. And after a couple of years, we sold the house on Delmore Avenue, and we had bought this house in 1968, and it was all ready for us, and we just came in and been happy ever since. So that's where I'm going to terminate this. And it's been nice to be able to talk, and I hope you can understand what I've said. But I'm not going to play around. This is the way it is, and this is the way it's going to be, and just accept it as your David Quarterdalley's little spiel. Thank you. Now look at it. Here. I will read the notice. Chose Hartwellville, the northernmost section of Reedsboro, because of its lush valley of greens, standing mountains filled with the trees and maples.